Today is Tuesday, June 2nd. The year is 2020. I'll be reading from TV Tropes page, Recap, Babylon 5, Season 2, Episode 3, The Geometry of Shadows, Wikipedia page for the Nika riots, TV Tropes page, Blue and Orange Morality, Wikipedia page, When the Looting Starts, the Shooting Starts, and Breathing, Chaos and Poetry by Franco Ifo Berardi. Do you believe in fate? Well, actually, I believe there are currents in the universe, eddies and tides that pull us one way or the other. Some we have to fight, some we have to embrace. Unfortunately, the currents that we have to fight look exactly like the currents we have to embrace. The currents that we think are the ones that's gonna make us stronger, they are the ones that are going to destroy us. And the ones that we think are going to destroy us, they are the ones that are going to make us stronger. Now the other current, yes or no? Yes, somewhat. Why? The Nika riots, Nika revolt, or Nika sedition took place against Emperor Justinian I in Constantinople over the course of a week in 532 CE. They were the most violent riots in the city's history, with nearly half of Constantinople being burned or destroyed and tens of thousands of people killed. The ancient Roman and Byzantine empires had well-developed associations known as demes, which supported the different factions or teams under which competitors in certain sporting events took part. This was particularly true of chariot racing. There were initially 4 major factional teams of chariot racing, differentiated by the color of the uniform in which they competed. The colors were also worn by their supporters. These were the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites. Although by the Byzantine era, the only teams with any influence were the blues and the greens. Emperor Justinian I was a supporter of the blues. The team associations had become a focus for various social and political issues for which the general Byzantine population lacked other forms of outlet. They combined aspects of street gangs and political parties, taking positions on current issues, notably theological problems or claimants to the throne. They frequently tried to affect the policy of the emperors by shouting political demands between races. The imperial forces and guards in the city could not keep order without the cooperation of the circus factions, which were in turn backed by the aristocratic families of the city. These included some families who believed they had a more rightful claim to the throne than Justinian. In 531, some members of the Blues and Greens had been arrested for murder in connection with deaths that occurred during rioting after a recent chariot race. Relatively limited riots were not unknown at chariot races, similar to the football hooliganism that occasionally erupts after association football matches in modern times. The murderers were to be executed, and most of them were, but on January 10, 532, 2 of them, a blue and a green, escaped and were taking refuge in the sanctuary of a church surrounded by an angry mob. Justinian was nervous. He was in the midst of negotiating with the Persians over peace in the east at the end of the Iberian War, and now he faced a potential crisis in his city. Facing this, he declared that a chariot race would be held on January 13th and commuted the sentences to imprisonment. The Blues and the Greens responded by demanding that the two men be pardoned entirely. Justinian and two of his leading officials, John the Cappadocian and Tribonian, were extremely unpopular because of the high taxes they levied, the corruption of the latter two, and John's cruelty against debtors. John and Justinian had also reduced spending on the civil service and combated the corruption of the civil service. The many nobles who had lost their power and fortune when removed from the smaller, less corrupt civil service joined the ranks of the Greens. Justinian was also reducing the power of both teams. The Greens, seeing this as further imperial oppression, akin to the reforms in the civil service, while the Blues felt betrayed. The Roman legal code had a popular image as the biggest distinguishing feature of the civilized Romans as compared to barbarians. The law code was also religiously important, as the Romans were believed to be chosen by God, it being a symbol of justice. As such, it brought legitimacy with it if an emperor successfully made significant legal reforms, but if this process bogged down, it showed divine anger. What had taken 9 years for the Theodosian Code took Justinian just 13 months. Just before the Nika riots of January 532, however, the pace of reforms had slowed to a crawl. At the same time, Justinian was fighting in an unsuccessful war against the Persians, while Byzantine victories at Dara, spring of 530, and Satala, summer of 530, had fostered his legitimacy for a short while. The defeat at Callinicum, 531, and negative strategic situation damaged the emperor's reputation. On top of that, the legal reforms were unpopular with the aristocracy from the start, as they made it impossible to use obscure laws and jurisprudence to avoid unfavorable verdicts, further angering the aristocracy. On top of this, both Justinian and his wife Theodora were of low birth. Late Roman and Byzantine society was not as class-driven as the feudal-dominated society of the West. The Greens were a monophysite group and represented the interest of the moneyed non-landowners, Justinian being neither of those two. When Justinian refused to pardon the two arrested rioters, there was already a deep-seated resentment among the general populace, as well as among the aristocracy. On January 13, 532, a tense and angry populace arrived at the Hippodrome for the races. The Hippodrome was next to the palace complex, and thus Justinian could watch from the safety of his box in the palace and preside over the races. From the start, the crowd had been hurling insults at Justinian. By the end of the day, at race 22, the partisan chants had changed from blue or green to a unified Nika, meaning win, victory, or conquer. And the crowds broke out and began to assault the palace. For the next 5 days, the palace was under siege. The fires that started during the tumult resulted in the destruction of much of the city, including the city's foremost church, the Hagia Sophia, which Justinian would later rebuild. Some of the senators saw this as an opportunity to overthrow Justinian, as they were opposed to his new taxes and his lack of support for the nobility. The rioters, now armed and probably controlled by their allies in the Senate, also demanded that Justinian dismiss the prefect John the Cappadocian and Quaestor Tribonian. They then declared a new emperor, Hypatius, who was a nephew of former Emperor Anastasius I. Justinian, in despair, considered fleeing, but his wife Theodora is said to have dissuaded him, saying, "Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. Never will I see the day when I am not saluted as Empress." She is also credited with adding, "Who is born into the light of day must sooner or later die. And how could an emperor ever allow himself to be a fugitive?" Although an escape route across the sea lay open for the emperor, Theodora insisted that she would stay in the city, quoting an ancient saying, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," or perhaps, "Purple makes a fine winding sheet." Purple makes a fine winding sheet. As Justinian rallied himself, he created a plan that involved Narses, a popular eunuch, as well as the generals Belisarius and Mundus. Carrying a bag of gold given to him by Justinian, the slightly built eunuch entered the hippodrome alone and unarmed against a murderous mob that had already killed hundreds. Narses went directly to the blues section, where he approached the important blues and reminded them that Emperor Justinian supported them over the greens. He also reminded them that Hypatius, the man they crowned, was a green. Then he distributed the gold. The blue leaders spoke quietly with each other, and then they spoke to their followers. Then, in the middle of Hypatius's coronation, the blues stormed out of the hippodrome. The greens sat, stunned. Then imperial troops, led by Belisarius and Mundus, stormed into the hippodrome, killing any remaining rebels indiscriminately, be they blues or greens. About 30,000 riders were reportedly killed. Justinian also had Hypatius executed and exiled, the senators who had supported the riot. He then rebuilt Constantinople and the Hagia Sophia and was free to establish his rule. To say that questions of morality are thorny and filled with gray when they aren't being hammered between stark absolutes is putting it mildly. Because of this, there can be great drama when characters who represent a wide range of moral viewpoints come together or into conflict. The strangest of these characters are those who espouse blue and orange morality. These characters have a moral framework that is so utterly alien and foreign to human experience that we can't peg them as good or evil. They aren't a chaotic neutral unfettered, though they may seem to act terrifyingly random, nor are they necessarily a lawful neutral fettered, because our and their understanding of law as a concept may not even be equivalent. There might be a logic behind their actions. It's just that they operate with entirely different sets of values and premises with which to draw their conclusions. It's also worth noting that such cultures are just as likely to be something we'd find appalling as they are to be something we'd find benign and/or weird. They may also find us appalling, benign, or weird, even if we don't see them that way. And although they are often likely to commit acts we would see as horrific, some are unusually benign. Either way, they tend to act as if nothing were the matter, because in their world or mind, that's just what they do. This trope is one of the trickier ones to pull off well, because most writers are human, and it's often hard to portray alien and truly foreign. Because of this, it's not uncommon for audience members to label these characters as designated heroes or villains due to human audiences often lacking the experience or knowledge that these fictional characters have. Audiences must remember that these characters are meant to be morally ambiguous. This is similar to values dissonance, but the main difference is that societies with values dissonance can, at least on a basic level, generally measure one another by the same concepts of good and evil, or even order and chaos. With blue and orange morality, the values are so foreign that such concepts can no longer be applied. They may not even know what these things are, or even if they do, will often find them confusing. The concepts are not necessarily beyond their grasp, mind you, but just aren't something which they play any importance on. Conversely, they may have these concepts, but apply them in vastly different ways, such as regarding motionlessness as the epitome of evil, or viewing exploration as an element of chaos. Note that cases involving solely a misapprehension of facts and consequences do not count here, no matter how alien the reasons. If, for example, a race of aliens thinks killing is okay because its own members respawn within a day with no harm done, and mistake humans as working the same way, that doesn't mean they wouldn't balk at killing if they realize the degree of harm it causes to other creatures. In this case, they may be working by comprehensible moral standards and just gravely mistaken about the implications of their actions. Likely candidates for blue and orange morality include the fair folk, who follow rules of their own making, eldritch abominations that are beyond comprehension, the more exotic starfish aliens, AIs, and robots, especially when super smart and or incapable of emotion. Another candidate is the power of money and the almighty dollar. The individual human or single members of any species whose majority falls into darker morality, who operates on this is the Übermensch of Nietzschean philosophy, a human being who has developed their own blue-orange set of morals. A nominal hero may have this motivation as well. Moral sociopathy overlaps strongly with this trope for obvious reasons, though this is not always the case. Compare xenofiction, humans are Cthulhu, humanity is infectious, all often invoking this. Above good and evil, affably evil, faux affably evil, they sometimes can come across as this. Even evil has standards when handled poorly or bizarrely. Evil cannot comprehend good. Less elaborate forms that resemble this in practice, and non-malicious monster, which occasionally requires this, and obliviously evil, when a villain thinks that his actions are acceptable or helpful. When two sides go to war and nothing will stop them except total annihilation, that's guilt-free extermination war. If the character genuinely knows everything will turn out okay, allowing the plot to treat them as a good guy, no matter how cruel, irresponsible, or fascist this makes them by our standards, that's omniscient morality license. This has nothing to do with the following: Bucknell University, the University of Illinois, the University of Virginia, the University of Florida, Auburn University, Syracuse University, Hope College, Gettysburg College, or Boise State University, the colors of all of which are blue and green, blue and orange, albeit different shades in each case. Nor the Denver Broncos, Chicago Bears, New York Knicks, New York Mets, New York Islanders, Edmonton Oilers, or Mango Sentinels, or the city of New York, for that matter. Furthermore, Do not confuse with blue and orange movies, even if they do overlap. Also has nothing to do with the karma meter in Mass Effect, nor the Aperture Science handheld portal device, the two most prominent ink colors in Splatoon, or even the light scheme in Tron and its universe. In 1967, Walter E. Headley, the police chief of Miami, Florida, said, in response to an outbreak of violent crime in the Christmas holiday season, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. He accused young hoodlums from 15 to 21 of taking advantage of the civil rights campaign that was then sweeping the United States. Having ordered his troopers to combat the violence with shotguns, he told the press that, "We don't mind being accused of police brutality." The phrase was used again by US President Donald Trump in 2020 in response to the George Floyd protests. After billions of years of evolution, substances transmuted into words. After combining and recombining atoms for countless eons, at a certain, uncertain point, matter entered into the cycle of signification. Wars, love, excitement, and elegance followed, and sensitive organisms went walking hand in hand over the bridge that transcends the primordial abyss of the absence of meaning. So we named the millennia, and we stayed at the top of the hill, gazing hopefully for a light in the distance. Then everything dissolved as an effect of acceleration, and now human signs are turning back into their original magma, where light glitters for no eyes, and information is eternally silent. Frail is the architecture of happiness, and heavy is the architecture of depression, as everybody knows. We all know from experience that brightness is easily shadowed, while the ensuing darkness is not as easy to dispel. Let's think of the oscillation between darkness and brightness in the history of social movements. Let's think of the sudden explosion of euphoria in urban insurrections, subversive cooperation, shared creation, squatting, and sustained occupation of building, streets, and squares. A social movement is essentially a shared illusion of sympathy among conscious and sensitive organisms who conjoin in a social process. Society is an imaginary sphere in which different processes of signification interweave and interfere. The symbolic organization of this imaginary sphere is an effect of signification. I define signification as the building of a bridge of shared illusions over the abyss of the absence of meaning. Reality, by contrast, can be described as the psychodynamic projection of countless mental flows that interweave, and intersect, building castles of language that we call different names: civilization, history, revolution, community. Unhappiness exists. This is easy to understand. It's more difficult to assert what happiness is, and if it actually exists anymore, anywhere. We can argue that happiness is a vague perception of the inner self's harmony with the ongoing flow of perception, and also that it is the sudden and random synchrony of a singular vibration with the cosmic game. Christians call this state grace. We experience happiness as the conscious suspension of the sight of the abyss. In those moments of suspension, we can build something, bridges over the abyss itself. Groundlessness, emptiness, and the decomposition of the bodily self These are the abyss that all human beings are experiencing. But women and men can happily walk over this abyss if they understand that friendship resides in the ability to share the illusion of meaning. When the illusion of meaning is shared, it is no longer an illusion. It becomes reality. The bridge over the abyss is the dialogue that allows for the sharing of a vision, of an expectation, of an intention. This dialogue is based on refrains of non-attachment, and it emancipates us from the fear of not being. Getting freed from the will to live is the condition for being alive at last. The bridge over the abyss of the absence of meaning can take many forms. Falling in love, tenderness, collective creation, hallucination, and movement. These forms give birth to the physical experience of meaning. Meaning is not a presence, but an experience. Meaning is an effect of signification that does not belong to nature, but only exists in consciousness, a floating composition of neurological flows, of bodily and psychological matter that takes a form. Friendship is the condition for the experience, the existence of meaning.